tonight. My name is Michael Hollerick. I'm a professor of the history of Christianity in the Theology department here at St. Thomas. And we've decided to offer a panel discussion on the opening months of the Pontificate of Pope Francis. Back in February, when the world was surprised by the abdication of Pope Benedict, the first such event in over 700 years, we organized a similar event to talk about the conclave that was due to open in a few days. Some of you might have been here for that. I remember saying at the time that I didn't think that the cardinals were likely to surprise us with their choice. Maybe they didn't think so either. But historians like to say that you can't predict the future, and the election of Jorge Bergoglio has proven that again. Without prejudging what our panelists are going to have to say here, Francis has clearly surprised a lot of people, and perhaps including a few cardinals. So we thought it might be a good idea then to offer another such public forum to talk over the impact of the new pope. We've invited 4 members of the theology department here to share their thoughts on the new pope. We were originally going to speak from a podium, but we decided to sit at the table. This is an egalitarian message. Seated at a table, we're all the same height. In order, we're going to hear from Massimo Fogiolio, who is Assistant Professor of the History of Christianity, John Martins, who is Associate Professor of New Testament, Corin Carvalho, Professor of Hebrew Bible and Old Testament, and Paul Voida, Associate Professor of Moral Theology. Each of them will get their turn. They're being given 10 minutes each. And when they're done, we've timed this to allow plenty of opportunity for you from the audience to ask questions. And a member of our theology club and a theology major, Gina Bugliosi, will pass around a handheld mic. When your opportunity comes to speak, I will call on you. Stand up and introduce yourself. It would be nice to know if you're a student at St. Thomas or a visitor from off campus. So, without further ado, Massimo?
Thank you, Michael. My job here tonight is to give an introduction to the most important facts of these first months of the Pontificate of Pope Francis, and in the second part to give my view of what are the most important signals or symptoms of this change. In the panel of last February, we had an idea that something was happening, and I think that our intuition was good. So I assume that we all know what happened in the conclave. Pope Francis was elected at the 5th vote, a fairly short and quick conclave. The surprises have come immediately afterwards. So when he came to the balcony, the fact that he was dressed quite differently from his predecessors, that he almost never used the word pope for a couple of days. He always emphasized the idea that he's a bishop of Rome. So there were signals that were more or less expected, something like that could be expected. Something that was not that expected or obvious was at the 4 weeks mark after his election on April the 13th, Pope Francis appointed a board of 8 cardinals for the reform of the Roman Curia and as an advisory board for the government of the world church. That is a completely new thing. So that never happened, that the Pope called a group of cardinals to work with him above the Roman Curia. That has never happened in modern church history. Exactly 4 weeks after, on May the 13th, so 2 months after his election, the Annuario Pontificio, the yellow pages of the Vatican, has in the first page always, every year, a statement on who's in charge, and the January Pontificio of the year 2013 has the usual page on Pope Francis, and what's new is that the title says only Francis, Bishop of Rome, and all the rest comes at the bottom of the page, very small. That is intentional. At the end of June, there was the publication of the encyclical Lumen Fidei that was publicized as the first encyclical of Pope Francis. Obviously, nobody believes that because that's not true. So Pope Francis signed that. But it's obvious that it's the last encyclical of Pope Benedict that Pope Francis had to, or accepted, or was happy, we don't know, to sign. But that's one of the elements of this very strange and extraordinary transition, which is unprecedented. At the beginning of July, in a couple of days, there were a couple of very important decisions. The first one, on the 5th of July, it was the announcement of the decree for the canonization of John Paul II and of John the 23rd. This last one is particularly important because Pope Francis decided the canonization of Pope John the 23rd in April 2014 in absence of the second miracle, which requires a special act of the Pope called technically ex certa scientia. So the Pope really knows that John the 23rd is a saint. So he doesn't need a second miracle. That is a very murky area, if you want, but that's important. And 2 days after, he went to the small island in the south of Italy, which is much closer geographically to Africa than to Italy, which is the usual place where immigrants come, and most of them die from Africa. The first pope to go there, the first Italian bishop, and everybody asked, why only now? And that was a remarkable visit. His homily, his speech, that said something. And in that homily, Pope Francis used this expression that we live in a globalized world, but it's also the globalization of indifference, which says something about his view of the world. And then, very quickly, the vigil of prayer for peace in Syria. In mid-September, he received in the Vatican the Latin American theologian Gustavo Gutierrez, who had been targeted by the Holy Office in the 1980s and 90s for a long time. And in the late 1990s, he had to escape his own country because he was on the death list. So being received in the Vatican, it's an extraordinary reversal of doctrinal policy. And then, 1 week after, on the 19th of September, the publication of the interview with the Jesuit magazines that I had the honor to be one of the translators into English. And then, at the beginning of October, the first meeting of the 8 cardinals, where the most important announcement was that there will be a reform of the Roman Curia that will not be a review. It will be a radical reshaping of the Roman Curia. And the final announcement was at the end of October that the next synod of the bishops in October 2014 will be on the family and the publication of this questionnaire. And so the questionnaire for the preparation of a synod is not new. What's new is the audience, which has been, it has been said very clearly that it has to be as wide, as broad this these questions must reach every parish, every church. So that's new. In the last couple of minutes, I think that I want to say something on 4 points that I think are part of this change. I don't use change easily as an historian, but I think that this is really an extraordinary year. First element, this is a pontificate that comes very clearly after a very serious crisis of the papacy as an institution. And we know that the basis for the resignation of Pope Benedict was age and health, but there's no doubt that it was a very low point in the reputation, in the authority of... so it's an extraordinary moment because Pope Francis knows that he has to build mostly on his example and not on the reputation. Second, what's important in this pontificate is that is happening what Yves Congar said at Vatican II, that in a globalized church, the orbis, so the global dimension of the church, takes possession of the urbs, of Rome. This is what's happening. So Pope Francis is the first pope of the post-Vatican II church. It's the real beginning of the post-Vatican II. All the other popes, they were part of the Second Vatican Council as bishops or as theologians, and they were rediscussing what they thought was unfinished business at Vatican II. Well, Pope Francis takes Vatican II for a fact that must be implemented, must be done. And this is my third point. I think that the debate on Vatican II is going to be important, especially because, and this is a supreme irony of a Jesuit pope, I think, is the first real pope of the post-Vatican II church, and he almost never mentions Vatican II, which is exactly what I would do. Because he knows that in these last 10, 15 years, Vatican II became a theological football, and in some quarters still is, in Italy especially. So he knows that to do Vatican II as a pope, you should not mention Vatican II too much. That's very, I admire that. And my last point is this. He is the first pope of a globalized church. What's different between him and his predecessors is that he has very little international experience. So we don't know how much he knows of other parts of the world, and to be very honest, I think that he doesn't know much about the North American Catholic Church, and that might be a problem because something might not change as much as it's needed or as much. But the same thing is for Europe. For him, Germany is as far as is for an Italian Brazil. It's the other part of the world. So that is an unknown. So we will see. He will receive probably next week Vladimir Putin of Russia, and in a few months probably the Patriarch of Moscow, which never happened before in church history. That might be a signal of what worldview he has. And I think I'm done.
Thank you. John.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. My comments are based on Pope Francis's interview in America Magazine, which Massimo and others translated, and which I take as a paradigm for his understanding of the Bible and of his pontificate, and I would say of Jesus' call to us. In the interview, he says, "That finger of Jesus pointing at Matthew, that's me." In the magnificent interview Antonio Spadaro, S.J., conducted with Pope Francis, many aspects of the Pope's life and mind emerged. Particularly interesting to me was the ways in which Scripture lies as a pattern or a foundation for his pattern of life and mind. In some ways, though, it's quite interesting. Scripture was not often quoted in the interview. And I take that, I think correctly, because it's foundational, it's groundwork for who he is and how he thinks. All popes are immersed in the gospel, I would say, and each of them focuses on particular aspects of the gospel and how they live and what they teach, which is not to say they ignore the rest, just that all of us have habits of mind. And I want to focus on 3 passages of Scripture that did surface as bedrock for this pope, 1 explicitly and 2 implicitly. In this section, Who is Jorge Mario Bergoglio?, Pope Francis speaks of the call of St. Matthew from the Gospel of Matthew 9:9. Hopefully you can see that. This is the only gospel which includes a call with the name of Matthew, and the actual calling is short, 1 verse. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. It's a minimal account, but it's what follows in Matthew 9:10-13 and beyond that gives it context. This is the actual painting of Caravaggio. I might come back to that, of the calling of Matthew that he talks about seeing in the Church of St. Louis of France near the Pantheon, for those of you who've been to Rome. It's a beautiful painting. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at a tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And as he sat at dinner in the house, many tax collectors and sinners came and were sitting with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard this, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners." Before examining the passage, listen to what the Pope says about it in the context of Caravaggio's painting of the scene. "I do not know Rome well. I know a few things. These include the Basilica of St. Mary Major. I always used to go there. I know St. Mary Major, St. Peter's. But when I had come to Rome, I always stayed in Via della Scrofa. From there, I often visited the Church of St. Louis of France, and I went there to contemplate the painting, The Calling of St. Matthew by Caravaggio. That finger of Jesus pointing at Matthew, that's me. I feel like him, like Matthew." Here the Pope becomes determined, as if he had finally found the image he was looking for. It's the gesture of Matthew that strikes me. He holds on to his money as if to say, "No, not me. No, this money is mine. Here, this is me, a sinner on whom the Lord has turned his gaze. And this is what I said when they asked me if I would accept my election as pontiff." Then the Pope whispers in Latin, like we all do when we whisper, "I'm a sinner, but I trust in the infinite mercy and patience of our Lord Jesus Christ, and I accept in a spirit of penance." In placing himself in the role of a sinner called by God, Pope Francis not only places himself in the role of the Apostle Matthew, but that of every person, all of whom are sinners and all of whom are called by God. In identifying, though, with the sinner, he also identifies with Jesus' mission to call all people to receive God's mercy without exception. When Jesus ate with many tax collectors and sinners, identifying with these outcasts, the religious experts of the day, the Pharisees, and they were expert and they were righteous in many respects, were upset. "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Jesus' response, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice. I've come to call not the righteous, but sinners." In identifying with the sinners, Pope Francis classifies his primary identity as a person who is saved by God's mercy, not as a religious expert. He also identifies the primary mission of the Church as reaching out to those who are sick, to offer healing to all those in need, modern-day tax collectors and sinners who might not previously have found a place at the table. And this is the act of extending mercy to all. This leads to the implicit identification of another gospel passage in the section Church as Field Hospital in the interview, though the imagery builds on Matthew 9:9-13 as well. But what I think lies behind it is the parable of the Good Samaritan. So I'll read some of this at any rate. I'll let, I think we have time to read it. "Just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. 'Teacher,' he said, 'what must I do to inherit eternal life?' He said to him, 'What's written in the law? What do you read there? He answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, you've given the right answer. Do this, and you will live. But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Jesus replied, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him into an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, take care of him. And when I come back, I'll repay you whatever more you spend. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? He said, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. Before examining the passage, here's what Pope Francis said about the church's field hospital. I see clearly that the thing the church needs most today is the ability to heal wounds and warm the hearts of the faithful. It needs nearness, proximity. I see the church as a field hospital after battle. It's useless to ask a seriously injured person if he has high cholesterol and about the level of his blood sugars. You have to heal his wounds. Then we can talk about everything else. Heal the wounds, heal the wounds. The church sometimes has locked itself up in small things and small-minded rules. The most important thing is the first proclamation, Jesus Christ has saved you. The Good Samaritan stands as the most likely passage behind this section of the interview due to the emphasis on heal the wounds of the seriously injured person. We must heal their wounds, and we must accompany them starting from their situation. It's necessary to accompany them with mercy. When the Samaritan comes across a man beaten on the road in Jesus' parable, he does not ask, how did you get yourself in this situation? What did you do to deserve this? Who are you? A Samaritan or a Jew? At personal risk to himself, since the robbers could still be present, the Samaritan helps the unknown man without any idea of the situation that led to this event or the man's identity. Note again, the religious experts do not stop and help, since they might have pressing responsibilities in the temple, where priests and Levites served the sacrificial system. This isn't an indictment, though, of the Jewish religious elite or the temple service. I think it's an indictment of any religious elite that places sacrifice over mercy. Remember Jesus' command from Matthew 9:13. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. The Good Samaritan parable puts into practice Jesus' command to learn that I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For at the end of the parable, Jesus asks the lawyer, a religious expert himself, which person had acted like a neighbor in this parable? The lawyer answered, the one who showed him mercy. In his words and actions, Pope Francis has identified with the sinners and the desire to go and do likewise. He sees the church's primary purpose to show abundant mercy to those who are hurt, wounded, and lost, because that's a mercy he himself has experienced. That finger of Jesus pointing at Matthew, that's me. As Pope Francis continued to say, proclamation in a missionary style focuses on the essentials, on the necessary things. Excuse me. This is also what fascinates and attracts more, what makes the heart burn, as it did for the disciples at Emmaus. We have to find a new balance, otherwise even the moral edifice of the church is likely to fall like a house of cards, losing the freshness and fragrance of the gospel. There's a third biblical reference that the Pope hid in there to Emmaus from Luke 24. In which Jesus appears to his downtrodden disciples, walking and talking with them, unbeknownst to them, for those of you who know that passage. When they recognize who it is, that it's Jesus, they say, were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us? To recognize Jesus, you need an encounter. And for that, you need an introduction. And mercy, this Pope is saying, is a good way to introduce people to Jesus.
Thank you, John. Dr. Carvalho.
Is it mine?
Technical glitch.
That was the choirs of angels. Good evening. I'm Dr. Corinne Carvalho, and although I'm a professor of Old Testament, I also teach in our Women's Studies program. I will speak briefly about the Pope's recent statements concerning women, the family, and sexuality. These will primarily utilize Pope Francis's interview in America, as well as the preparatory document for the Synod next October on pastoral challenges to the family. By way of background, I completed an undergraduate Catholic Studies program and also completed my master's degree at Jesuit institutions. And although I did that, I'm a member of the Lutheran Church, the LCA. The vast majority of my teaching has been in Catholic settings, however, both here at St. Thomas and also in the community here and across the country, where I've had many opportunities to hear how people young and old struggle with the Catholic Church's teachings on gender and sexuality. It has been years since I've witnessed so much hope in a pope. I know that rhymes. Even I, who am usually cynical about these things, have been stunned by some of what he has said about the various populations in the church who have felt marginalized and even sometimes demonized. For Catholics in Minnesota, his now famous statement, "Who am I to judge?" starkly contrasts with the judgmental rhetoric that has been de rigueur from the local prelate. His ability to empathize, for instance, with the struggle experienced by a woman who has had an abortion, demonstrates in a concrete and tangible way his understanding of what a pastoral response actually looks like. I am struck by the breadth of his ability to listen compassionately to the experiences of the people in the world today. Because his language is so unprecedented from the papacies in the decades following Vatican II, many theologians, Catholic and not, disagree about the intention and impact of his statements. Is he signaling an openness to revisit doctrinal issues? Or is this simply a kinder, gentler evangelization? One thing that is clear, he has said nothing that contradicts the Church's teaching on marriage, contraception, right to life, remarriage after divorce, the fundamental nature of women, or homosexuality. So why are the liberals so hopeful and the conservatives so nervous? It is this bigger question that I would like to focus on for a couple of minutes. It is clear that the Pope's focus on pastoral response is not just media window dressing. The preparatory document on the Synod asks bishops to survey their own dioceses with respect to 8 issues facing contemporary families, including divorce, contraception, and same-sex attraction. The questions ask people for honest responses to issues they have felt silenced on in the past. While an individual may feel comfortable talking to a local priest about an impending divorce, it is quite another to ask that person how the church can be Christ to them. Let's face it, just the fact that the people experiencing the divorce are being asked how it affects their religion, instead of being told by a celibate body how they should feel or function within the church, is, well, almost Protestant. But the real question is, what does the church plan to do with this information? First, let's be clear. We already know the answers to those questions. With respect to communion, when people are told they can come over to your house for dinner and watch you eat, but can't eat themselves because you are somehow unworthy, they are not only not making you feel welcome, they are, those people who are invited are insulted that they should feel grateful to have the opportunity to watch others eat. While it is not my job to tell you who to invite to dinner, the fact remains that if you invite me only to watch, I will politely decline. And I will assume that this liturgical practice says something essential about your theology. Lex orandi, lex credendi. Since I assume that my response is one shared by many others who are told not to participate in communion, then I would conclude that the Vatican survey is not primarily about gathering information that the Church does not have. The obvious answer to why the Pope is surveying the diocese is that he wishes to improve the pastoral response to people who live imperfect lives. The Synod's title focuses on the need for an examination of pastoral practices. The second half of the title is also revealing. It's in the context of evangelization. The Synod's goal is to rethink how it proclaims the gospel message in the world. In his interview with America, Pope Francis talked about the Jesuit principle of reading the signs of the times. As someone Jesuit trained, this approach to theology resonates with me. Some Protestant theologies have an explicit role for experience in shaping theology. Thus, the Lutheran Church is, quote, always reforming, meaning it is always responding to the modern world in the light of Christ. Vatican II documents talk about the need of the Church to respond to the modern world. Pope Francis also talks about the Church as being the whole body of the Church, especially the laity. Lastly, he stresses the role of discernment in any ecclesial decision. So is he asking for this information as a step towards discerning where the Holy Spirit is leading the Church today? In other words, is he suggesting that human experience of God in people's family lives should call on a revisiting of doctrinal statements? It is this that has conservatives nervous and liberals hopeful. The media has zeroed in on the Pope's statements on two subjects in particular: women and homosexuality. In my last few minutes, I would like to turn to those two issues. Close attention to what the Pope has said doctrinally about women demonstrates little change from his predecessors in thinking on gender. In the interview, he says that women are needed in the Church because of their, quote, feminine genius, unquote. This language was prominent in Pope John Paul II's understanding of the dignity of women. The phrase expresses the Pope's assumption that gender is an essential category of human experience, i.e., that people are born into a fixed gender identity that gives them special gifts or charisms. At this point, Pope Francis has simply alluded to earlier teachings and not given his own account of them, so I assume that he accepts these teachings. In the work of previous popes, especially John Paul II, the teaching leaves little room for gender fluidity and does not address what it means for those who do not have or exhibit those charisms. For example, if the property of femininity is nurturing, what does that say about the female who is not very nurturing? Is it an inherent disorder, or is it a moral fault? Many women have felt that people view it as a moral fault, a decision that they have made, yet it is this teaching that bolsters the view that not only do children need two parents who nurture them and provide structure, but there needs to be a woman in the household doing one of those tasks and a man in the household doing the other. The way that the teaching applies to persons who experience same-sex attraction, however, suggests that these are categories about essence. This is evidenced not just in the fact that homosexual feelings are described as gravely disordered, that language of disorder, but also by the argument that heterosexual marriage is part of the natural law. This argument is repeated in the preparatory document. If heterosexual marriage, then, is part of the natural law, we return to the two questions asked before. Why does Pope Francis want to know about the experience of people who are viewed as disordered or living in a way that does not replicate that natural law, whether through single parenting, same-sex marriage, or regulating openness to fertility through man-made means, for example? And second, if it is a disorder to not identify with the categories of one's biological gender, then when do my acts as a woman, for instance, violate that order? Is it sinful for me not to act in a way that is nurturing? At this point, Pope Francis' statements do not address these questions because, as he said in his interview, the first step for theology is discernment, aided in part through listening. Pope Francis also uses Scripture as a support for heterosexual marriage. In fact, in line with church documents before him, he invokes the creation of humans in Genesis 1, the etiology of heterosexual marriage in Genesis 2, and the use of metaphors of marriage in both Song of Songs and the Prophets. As a biblical scholar, I will simply say that there are a variety of ways to interpret these texts. For example, the fact that Genesis 1:26 states that God is both male and female suggests that humans who transgress gender categories are more like God than unlike God. Or the fact that the etiology of marriage in Genesis 2 does not explicitly mention procreation suggests that the biblical text is about the goodness of marital bonds, whether or not they are open to children. As a scholar of the prophets, I was pleased that the document not only referenced the positive view of marriage in Song of Songs, but also the horribly shocking use of the image in the prophets, even if the document does not interpret these images in the same way that I would. At this point, then, the Catholic Church has a pope whose radical difference is in his willingness to listen to the laity. Note that this is only radical because recently the hierarchy of the Catholic Church has put more institutional efforts into censoring than listening. Let me be clear. I applaud his move. I do think the only way to effect real change is through listening to the stories of others. But listening is not action. And I, as I am sure is true for many of you, am curious about what actions he will take in these particular issues. Let me end with one action that he could do that would speak more about his commitments to not just listening, but also hearing. In his interview, Pope Francis talks about his personal need for community and speaks authentically about his own Jesuit community as part of his spiritual well-being. In the Catholic Church in the United States today, the requirement of celibacy for diocesan priests cuts them off from community. When I was young, the Catholic parishes had at least a few priests who lived together. Now these men are alone, sometimes serving several parishes. The prohibition on a married clergy is not a doctrinal issue and could be more easily changed. Such a change would have three benefits that would fit Pope Francis's own spirituality. It would provide an opportunity for these men to have community and wholeness. It would be a powerful symbol of the Church's recognition that marital sexuality is a vehicle of sacramental grace, and it would undercut the kinds of subtle messages given to women that they somehow threaten sanctity. I like this Pope, and I hope that he is asking people about their experiences because he is open to the work of the Holy Spirit in the laity as well as the hierarchy. And I look forward to watching how this plays out over the next decade or more. Thank you.
My colleague has stolen my microphone.
Sorry.
I got to turn to Paul Voida now for our last presentation.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. You've been sitting listening to the talking heads for a while here. I'm supposed to say something about moral theology, which, as we all know, is the least controversial of theological subdisciplines. So you will be forgiven if you nod off as I talk. Actually, thanks, Dr. Carvalho. I thought I was going to be saying the controversial things, but in any case, we're all familiar with some of the surprising statements that Francis made, some of which have already been mentioned. Who am I to judge, right? On the return trip from World Youth Day. In the interview, the La Civiltà Cattolica interview, translated among others by Massimo, among others, he wrote, "We cannot insist only on issues related to abortion, gay marriage, and the use of contraceptive methods. This is not possible. I have not spoken much about these things, and I was reprimanded for that. But when we speak about these issues, we have to talk about them in a context. The teaching of the Church, for that matter, is clear, and I am a son of the Church, but it is not necessary to talk about these issues all the time." And then finally, his interview in La Repubblica with the founding editor of that paper, Scalfari. "Everyone has his own idea of good and evil and must choose to follow the good and fight evil as he conceives them. That would be enough to make the world a better place." So all of these remarks, which of course were delivered in a conversational context, have attracted enormous attention and elicited a good deal of controversy. What's going on here? Is Francis changing, or at least playing fast and loose with settled Catholic moral doctrine, especially on matters of sex and marriage? The short answer is no. But I think he is changing the face of what I would call the Catholic moral witness. How so? By challenging the long-standing Catholic practice of distinguishing sharply between morality and proclamation, between morality, or between ethics, you might say, and kerygma, proclamation, and of making the moral doctrinal horse pull the evangelical cart, if you will. For Francis, this gets things backwards. For Francis, the gospel message, the proclamation that in Jesus Christ, God has reconciled the world and is reconciling the world to himself, is the indispensable and necessary context for the church's moral message. That's putting the evangelical horse before the moral doctrinal cart. I want to pursue this a little bit. That's my basic message, I think. But what I want to do is elaborate on it a bit by drawing a comparison between Francis and his predecessor, John Paul II, with whom he actually, I think, has a lot in common. And I would call these remarks a tale of two cities. A tale of two cities. Nova Huta is the one city, and Via 31 is the other city. Nova Huta, of course, is the model workers' city that was put together by the Communist Party in Poland in the late 1950s. It was intended to be an example to the rest of the world of what a communist state was capable of doing. Of course, it had no church by design. It was built on the outskirts of Krakow, and that was where, of course, a young Karol Wojtyła was the archbishop. In 1959, in response to the felt need of the workers living in Nova Huta for liturgical celebration, Wojtyła celebrated midnight mass, impromptu. A cross was erected overnight, a mass was celebrated, the next day the cross was taken down by the communists. Over a series of weeks, months, and then even years, the same thing was repeated. Finally, in 1967, the Communist Party relented and they allowed a new church to be built there, the Ark Church, in 1967. Now, the architecture of Nova Huta encapsulated the fundamental distortion. The architecture of the city itself encapsulated the fundamental distortion of the communist system. In this way, the distortion was this: the assault on human dignity by the denial of the truth about human persons and their flourishing, of which solidarity was absolutely crucial. So solidarity. The Communist Party, they were corrupt, but they weren't dumb. They understood that in order to create absolute fidelity to the state, you needed to attack every possible form of community that represented a threat to the fidelity to the state, and that meant constructing apartment houses where it was impossible for neighbors to actually meet one another without going outside and around a circuitous bend to get up to the other apartment, right? So, and of course, they were also very good at attacking the forms of trust that were developed and were nourished within families, husbands, wives, parents, children, extended families, and so forth. Anyone who knows any history of the Communist Party and how it worked knows all this. So the liturgical, bringing the Mass to the people, whose piety itself, right, was the attraction, was crucial for Wojtyła and the Church in his ongoing war against communism. Of course, fast forward, communism falls in Poland and the Soviet Union, late 80s, early 90s. With that, John Paul II turns his sights on a similar dynamic, an attack upon solidarity in Western liberal democracies. Here, solidarity among human beings is under assault, among many other ways, by the establishment of laws that permitted human beings to take the lives of others. Obviously, abortion being the primary case, but not the only case. If John Paul II obsessed about abortion, and I think it's fair to say he did, and about sex and marriage, I think it's because of his view that the family was in many ways the cradle of this solidarity, and the special bond between the mother and the unborn child was something that exemplified this solidarity, and the very idea of that bond being broken or attacked was something he could barely fathom, and it horrified him, I think. In 1993, he writes Veritatis Splendor, the Splendor of Truth, followed 2 years later by the Gospel of Life, Evangelium Vitae, that reflect, I think, this fundamental concern. But it was in the latter document, the Gospel of Life, that John Paul II proposed a fundamental distinction between a culture of life and a culture of death. Now, both those papal encyclicals are deeply theological. At the heart of the Church's message about life is the crucified Jesus. But the broad outlines of the gospel message were, John Paul II says, accessible to human reason. And so the document was read, the Gospel of Life, and is read, I think, today, less for what it says about God's mercy than for its condemnation of any and all actions opposed to life, including contraception. So in short, under John Paul II, the Church's moral teaching, especially on matters of sex and marriage, end up bearing the weight of its ultimately evangelical message. Again, the moral horse coming before the evangelical cart. And of course, after a while, the cart is detached altogether. Francis. Here my remarks are very much indebted to the very nice biography by Paul Villeli, published in early August, called Pope Francis, Untying the Knots. Via 31 is the name of one of the many slums on the outskirts of Buenos Aires. It's certainly not a model workers' city by any stretch, and it was in no sense planned, but hardly accidental. There's a long history of socioeconomic inequality and oppression in South America and Argentina in particular. By the 1970s, and I'm going to go really quickly here, by the 1970s, Francis's own Jesuit order, under the influence of then the burgeoning liberation theology movement and Pedro Arrupe, had caused a sea change, and many Jesuits, including close personal friends of Bergoglio, his teachers actually, had gone to live, in response to this theology, had gone to live in these slums among the people. Bergoglio, as the newly appointed novice master and actually provincial of the Jesuits in Argentina, at this point, this is early 70s, 72, 73, 73, did not like this one bit. And two Jesuits in particular, Father Orlando Llorio and Father Franz Jelix, were told to move out, get away from the slums. They refused. This infuriated Bergoglio, and he suspended their faculties to say Mass. That was all that in 76, the military junta needed to go in and seize them. The two men were imprisoned and tortured for 5 months. Llorio later died. Jelix, I believe, is still alive, living in a retreat house in Germany. The experience of this, and I think an extended period of time, there's more detail when we have time to go into right now, I think profoundly, and Villeli says, profoundly changed Bergoglio. His experience during the Dirty War, 73 to 83 in Argentina. So by the time he returns to Buenos Aires as a bishop, auxiliary bishop in 1992, he's a changed man. In fact, he's now sending priests to live in the slums, the villas miserias. He had learned what Llorio and Jelix discovered many years before. They weren't bringing the gospel, as much as bringing the gospel to the poor. They were there because in the encounter, they discovered the mercy of Jesus Christ. They were as much evangelized as evangelizers. It's said that after he became archbishop, Bergoglio, the Pope of the slums, perhaps visited well over half of the people in those slums. The story is told that some years later, Bergoglio and Jelix, the priest who had been tortured, met in Germany and celebrated Mass together, the first time either had seen the other since the events of the 70s. They wept and were reconciled. In an interview in 2010, Bergoglio confided to the journalists interviewing him, "It would be wrong for me to say that these days I ask forgiveness for the sins and offenses that I might have committed. Today I ask for forgiveness for the sins and offenses that I did indeed commit. Guilt by itself is just another human resource. Guilt without atonement does not allow us to grow. There is no clean slate. We have to bless the past with remorse, forgiveness, and atonement." And in one of the last messages to his flock in Buenos Aires before leaving for the conclave this past spring, he wrote, "Morality is not never falling down, but always getting up again. And that is a response to God's mercy." Final remark. Francis, I think, is unlikely to write an encyclical on morality like John Paul II's Veritatis Splendor, the splendor of truth. But if he did, I think it might well be called Misericordiae Splendor, the splendor of forgiveness. And the outlines of it perhaps can be discerned in the first Sunday homily he delivered as Pope. The fifth Sunday of Lent, the gospel reading was the woman caught in adultery, in which I'll just quickly read the final paragraph, final two paragraphs. "I think we too," he said, "are the people who on the one hand want to listen to Jesus, but on the other hand at times like to find a stick to beat others with, to condemn others. And Jesus has this message for us, mercy. I think, and I say this with humility, that this is the Lord's most powerful message, mercy. It was he himself who said, 'I did not come for the righteous. The righteous justify themselves.' Go on then, even if you can do it. I cannot, but they believe they can. I came for sinners." That is the only advice Jesus gives you. Ask for forgiveness. After a month, if we are in the same condition, same situation, having fallen back, sinned yet once more, he says, let us go back to the Lord. The Lord never tires of forgiving, never. It is we who tire of asking his forgiveness. Let us ask for the grace not to tire of asking forgiveness, because he never tires of forgiving. Let us ask for this grace. Thanks.
You have some word.
Okay, we would like now to invite the audience to ask questions either of the panel in general, in which case I'll invite one of my colleagues to speak up, or to address questions to somebody in particular. Gina Buffiosi has a handheld mic, which she will bring around to you. I remind you, stand up and introduce yourself. In particular, we'd like to know if we have St. Thomas students with us or visitors from off campus.
Good evening, and thanks very much for conducting this panel. I think it was very interesting and welcoming. My name's Joe Reed. I'm a neighbor, a retired neighbor. And my question is for John. He spoke about mercy and righteousness and used the example of the Good Samaritan. And I think part of our problem, which I think the Pope is addressing, is that somehow some of us think we're righteous and forget that we're all sinners. So my question is, was the Good Samaritan a sinner, or was he righteous?
I don't know him that well, but no, I do think, I mean, from the account, I think the choice that Jesus makes of choosing a Samaritan, who were not well loved in the Jewish community of the day for a number of reasons, is the same kind of example that we might say, you know, in certain circles, you know, a Catholic priest walked by, a Lutheran pastor walked by, but the Muslim stopped. I think Jesus is saying at the end of the parable, go and do likewise. And what the Samaritan does is he acts because he sees someone in need. And I think, yes, I mean, I would say the Samaritan has acted righteously. And I know the issue, and it's this balance, right? There are righteous people who are more righteous than me. Certainly, I know that. But I think Jesus points this out constantly, and I do think this is what Pope Francis has been pointing to. When we focus on the sins of others, we start forgetting our own. And that, I think, is a danger of focusing on a couple of particular issues. I don't do that, I don't do that, I don't do that. Thank God I'm not like those other people who do that. And in the meanwhile, you're overlooking your own faults and your own need for mercy, your own need for forgiveness. As you know, Paul had some beautiful citations from the Pope about, you know, constant need for forgiveness. And so, I mean, Jesus himself in Matthew 7 talks about this. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye and not the log in your own eye? And so I think we're all being called to constantly strive to do better, and we are able to be forgiven. But yeah, I would say the Samaritan has acted righteously in that situation. Thank you.
I'd echo Joe's comments about gratitude for your having done the hard work of putting this thing together for us. I'm Lucy Armand. I'm the Director of Faith Formation at St. Odelia in Shoreview. And I'd be curious, comments from anyone. At least in the preliminary comments we've heard so far from Francis, he has a different way of articulating the manner in which he understands the Holy Spirit to inspire and move with the church. He's talking a lot about the Spirit of God being with the church when the people, the bishops, the Bishop of Rome, all think together. He talks about thinking with the church. And that seems to me to be moving toward not necessarily a redefinition, but a broadened understanding of infallibility. Now, of course, if you broaden the definition of infallibility in the way he seems to be moving towards doing, you invite challenges to your own definition, among other things, because you're no longer arrogating to yourself the ability to define it singularly as Pope. Comments?
In Catholic ecclesiology, the infallibility, I mean, the personal infallibility of the Pope is like the nuclear weapon, which is most effective if you don't use it. If you use it, it's the total destruction of the whole universe. So in his interview with America, that has been published in America, he says something about Lumen Gentium, chapter 3, and he says something, I don't expect him to do dramatic changes in that, because in the history, in these last couple of decades, we have seen that sometimes John Paul II had the temptation to declare doctrines infallibly personally, and paradoxically, Cardinal Ratzinger told him not to, because he knew exactly that it's a very strange kind of weapon. So what I see in Pope Francis is that I don't see in him a very marked ecclesiology. I see that his view of the church is mostly spiritual, because, and I agree with Pope with Paul Voida, that the most important biography. sorry. That the most important biography of Pope Francis is the one by Paul Vallely, and it shows that Jorge Mario Bergoglio is a survivor. He has survived so many odds. I mean, when they took his lands, when he was a failed provincial of the Jesuits, a failed doctoral candidate, almost a retired bishop of Buenos Aires. So I think that he sees a lot through his experience, his spiritual experience, and in the sense is a very ancient kind of pope. He has been bishop only of 2 cities, of Buenos Aires and of Rome. He is not a careerist, not at all. So I see that in him. I don't expect this kind of personal changes. He doesn't want, it seems to me, to make radical changes in anything personally. He married priests. He knows that heal the wounds applies first to the church as a body. And he was talking about himself. I have to heal the wounds of the church. He knows that he couldn't say that so openly, but this is my understanding.
I'm Zach Beckman, and I'm actually a student here. And I just have a question for the entire panel. If you had to sum up like the core of Francis's message to us as the body of the church, what do you think it would be? If you had to pick like a core, it could be like a word or a sentence or anything, just to kind of sum it all up. That'll work.
Oh,
Please.
I'm thinking.
Say an ear for how one sounds. It's one thing to speak with authority. It's another thing to be effectively heard. He has part of the attention given to him, I think, reflects that that he is more aware, sometimes certainly, than his immediate predecessor, who, for all of his virtues, had the tin ear for which, frankly, German professors are traditionally known. I think that Francis understands that authority, it must be aware of how it's heard. That's what I would say.
I would say I was struck by his use in the first few days of the idea of going to the peripheries of the world, to the existential peripheries. He has been on the margins for his whole life until he was elected at 76. So I see in him an idea of recentering the whole Catholic phenomenon, the Catholic Church, less around a culture, around a code, and more around the idea of mercy, of a more pastoral church. That's what I see.
Go ahead, Paul.
I was going to say all of these things I would echo, but I'll say conversation. And the kind of personal conversation. I mean, almost everything we're hearing from him these days, except for his homilies and so forth, the things that have caused such a splash have come in the context of personal interviews where he's in a dialogue with someone, back and forth. He really likes this format, apparently. He's calling people on the phone, you know. So the personal contact and conversation, the personal touch, and understood is surrounded by the sense of God's mercy.
If you get an international call on your phone, don't be quick to answer it.
We could choose all of these. I do think through his actions there's a genuine recapitulation of Jesus' teaching to love one another. And I think Massimo's point is heal the wounds of the church. Maybe that is primarily first in the body of Christ, in which there have been such huge divisions, sometimes unspoken, of right wing and left wing, where people really are saying, even if not publicly, to their friends or to others, they're not really good Catholics or good Christians. And we need to stop that. And so I think he's saying, first of all, that we need to love one another in the church, and that love needs to be made manifest in the world.
So does his empathy make him maybe better suited to deal with the problems that he did in, especially as he really listened? Because that's kind of the background I get from what I'm able to see.
I would say that he's a strange kind of Jesuit because, because, and if you read the interview, it's very clear, he considers himself that he had been a bad Jesuit until he became bishop. And if you remember that the founder of the Jesuits was against Jesuits becoming bishops, that's paradoxical. But he became a good pastor very late in his life, So he's very atypical. He spent 10 years in the wilderness. I mean, ecclesiastically speaking, I mean, having very little to do or nothing. So I think that what's really remarkable in him and different, maybe I see him close to Pope John XXIII, that he wants to be really bishop, and not Bishop of Rome because it's part of the package. No, he wants to be the Bishop of Rome. That's kind of new, except Pope John in 1958-63. He did that. I see many parallels between these two popes.
Hi, my name is Bryce, and I'm also a student here. I wanted to tie a few things that I've heard together tonight and question the panel about the Pope's vision moving forward. One of them was the analogy about being invited to dinner but not being allowed to eat. And going forward with the Good Samaritan and moving out and Jesus' message of love and embracing your neighbor and loving them, regardless of their differences. And so I'm wondering, with all the changes, especially here in the States that we're seeing, and maybe globally, if you think the church will start to move in a direction that is not as, I think rule-based is the wrong word, but more inclusive of homosexuality, of gender equality, and these issues.
I don't know if it will. And I think essential to part of the question is the relationship between the notion of the sinful nature of any person and the communion table as a table of communion, as opposed to the communion table as it's a very different sacramental view, right? So when the communion table becomes the means by which group identity is let me say just policed, or by which group identity becomes the essential element of participation, it's a very different view of what communion's about than Jesus offering it to all who believe in Jesus. And so it's a much bigger issue than it might look at from the outside, because it's a very different view of that sacramental action and what its purpose is. So I don't. To me, that's really the question. Is I don't know what that's going to look at. Obviously, everybody who goes to communion who's a Catholic goes as a sinner, because we are all sinners. We are all imperfect. So it's really that issue about whether or not you're in communion with the community that renders whether somebody is in or out, invited or not.
I can't remember the context. I think it was actually the La Repubblica interview where the Pope said, rather surprisingly, that the two biggest, call them moral problems of the day, are youth unemployment and the abandonment of the elderly. I think it's worth thinking about in terms of your question, Bryce. So what direction is he pushing us as the church? What direction is he prompting us to consider? I think his disarming language, his disarming gestures are at the very least asking us to consider the very categories in which we frame what we think the issues are, and where the most urgent problems are that need to be addressed. What would it mean to take seriously youth unemployment? This was a huge issue in the slums, right, around Buenos Aires, and it was directly related, it is directly related to the high rate of gang violence, right? The kids have nothing to do. I'm not sure what the issues are in Argentina as far as the elderly go, but I would say that these are both problems that we have here as well. So.
Do we have more questions?
If I may add something about that. In my opinion, if we want to understand the Francis phenomenon, we should ask ourselves how we would perceive him if his immediate predecessor would be not Benedict XVI, but John Paul II. And so there is a rebound effect visually. I mean, we see a stark difference because in this last decade, at some level in this church, there has been a clear push for a more exclusive kind of Catholicism. So we see him, I think, overly inclusive, extraordinarily generous. I think that is a very mainstream kind of Catholic. So, and here I'm not accusing Pope Benedict of anything. I'm accusing the ones who have used Pope Benedict for a number of things. That is a thing that is very clear to everybody who has lived in the Catholic Church in this last decade. So I think that there is a genuine amount of new things in him, but there's also a quantity of things that we see radically different from normal, because what we have seen in some areas of the world, especially in these last 10 years, was not normal. That's my impression, especially coming from Europe. So I came from Italy 6 years ago, almost 6 years ago, and I had this impression that Catholicism in this country was very close to the practice of shunning people out of churches, which is a non-Catholic practice. It is Calvin. I mean, it is something else. Okay, so I think that this perception is particularly strong in the United States, because it's a church that is particularly affected or touched by some kind of issues, and particularly touched by a certain kind of leadership. There's no question about that. So we should be honest about that. That would make of Pope Francis a much more normal kind of bishop and of pope. That's my view, at least.
My name is Matt Shireman. I'm in Theology 1 at the St. Paul Seminary. This question is directed to our moral theologian and perhaps Dr. Martins. We talked about whether the wagon of charisma is ahead of the wagon of morality, and I'm sort of wondering if maybe we should not think of them as separate wagons, but one in the same wagon. We talked a lot about the interview in America magazine. One thing that wasn't really in the press much was the day after the release of that interview, Pope Francis met with gynecologists, and I quote of Pope Francis, "Every unborn child, though unjustly condemned to be aborted, has the face of the Lord, who even before his birth, and then as soon as he was born, experienced the rejection of the world." So any comments on that?
You can start now.
Yeah, my point was that not that John Paul II saw it this way, but that if you look at Veritatis Splendor, the first chapter, where he begins interestingly, and this is something John might want to talk about in terms of your choice of biblical text, right? Where you start says a lot, right? So John Paul II in that encyclical, as many of you may recall, begins with the account in Matthew 19 of the rich young man, right, coming to Jesus, asking, "What good must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Why do you ask what is good? There's only one alone who is good," and so forth. But then he proceeds to tell him, well, you know what to do. It's the law, right? Now, if you wish to be perfect, right, go sell everything. And so then the evangelical counsels and so forth. And John Paul II uses that structure, right, to present a vision of the Catholic moral life, Catholic moral teaching, that has its perfection, right, in the life of the Spirit, in the community, and it's all about grace, right? But it begins, right, with the law, with so Jesus teaches the law to the young man. And of course, it's the natural law, basically. When he says then in the Gospel of Life, right, that the rudimentary outlines of the Gospel of Life, right, the Christian message concerning life, can be known through reason itself. Not in all of its details, certainly not the fullness of it. And then proceeds to rely upon his own magisterial authority to solemnly reinforce traditional prohibitions on abortion and euthanasia and so forth. Of course, also a changing church doctrine on capital punishment, forcing a revision of the catechism. But in saying that the essentials here are open to reason and so forth, suggest that what the church has, at least at the outset, to offer, the way we should lead, right, is with the natural law, right? And I've actually anecdotally have had very faithful Catholic folks, friends who tell me, what the church really has to offer the world is this natural law. That's our gift to the world, natural law. And I think that's just a minuscule part of the story. I think what Francis is doing is saying, no, what we offer, what our work is as a church, right, is to offer God's grace, is to offer mercy, right, first, right? That's what you begin with. Then you start talking about, well, what does a response to that mercy look like and entail and require, right? So I agree with you. I don't think, the citation you or the quotation you read after the American interview, yeah, like I said, he's not changing doctrine or proposing to change doctrine. I really don't think that. But he is changing teaching, if that makes sense, right? He's changing by challenging us, I think, to see how the church's moral teaching is to use a liberation theology term, a second act to the fundamental proclamation of God's reconciling love in Jesus. Right?
Yeah, can I follow that up, Paul, a bit? I took a note on the moral horse no longer pulling the evangelical cart, because I really did like that image. And one of the reasons I liked it is I do think, as Paul says, it depends on your starting point, both with respect to gospel passages, etc. But one of the great gifts, I think, of the Catholic Church is this, there's no desire just to pick out a particular verse, right? You can find certain churches that will start with a particular pastor who has a particular theme of a particular verse, and that's it. That's the focus. And the Catholic Church teaches the fullness of the gospel. But ultimately, the fullness of the gospel is an encounter with a person, and that's Jesus Christ. And so what I think Pope Francis is saying is, you need to have this encounter This encounter is essential, which is why I think the Emmaus reference that he is almost sort of thrown in at the end of the interview that I was citing from is so significant. How do you have that encounter? Well, one way you can do it is take a stick and beat people with all the teachings and all the things they're doing wrong. That is one way. I think the way you talk to people, this gets to Corey's point about listening to people and genuinely hearing them, it makes a difference how people tell you the truth. It makes a difference as to how people talk to you. Do they take you seriously as a human being? Do they really care for you, even if they're telling you ultimately the same thing? Now, I think it's quite interesting because, again, Corey, Massimo, Paul, I think all of us have said, not sure what's really shifting here other than emphasis, but this emphasis matters. And so I really did like that image of sort of the evangelical horse pulling the moral cart, because there are some things that only make sense in retrospect. And I wonder if we need to think, too, about the way in which the Christian message is encountered, and do people know it that well any longer? You know, how well do people know it? And so what do you need to bring to them? And I think that is initially the person of Jesus Christ and that merciful encounter. Then I think people are open to thinking about what the church has to say. But I really do think it matters how it's presented. I think that's not insignificant. I'll stop there.
Well, while the mic is being passed, I would second or third what my colleagues here have been saying, that the style and the manner of speaking matters enormously, and that if you want to be heard, that you have to take this seriously into account, and simply repeating what you've been saying louder is not known to be an effective means of communication.
My name is Jim Reddy. I'm a local Jesuit and happened to be in Buenos Aires with the Pope long ago during his ordination year, and I'm terribly relieved that he's there in Rome now. The communication that you spoke of, just a quick story. I was driving down Snelling. You've heard of Snelling? and it was, I tried to make a yellow light. Didn't make it. The police officer was right behind me the whole time. The lights go on, and the siren, and I pulled over, and then I froze. And I was uptight. I handed over my license. He went and ran my plates, came back, and handed me the license, my driver's license, and then he looked at me and he said, "What happened?" And my stress level went way down. And I told him what happened. And then he said, "Was this an emergency?" And it went down even more. Now I got a ticket. I got a ticket, but I had an experience of a whole methodology, or a whole different approach to listening that does not typify my experience in the church yet, but I sure hope it does. Thank you. Hope that exemplifies what you're talking about.
Very quickly, Jim Martin, I'm off campus. The Pope was supposed to have said immediately after he was elected to his colleagues, "May God forgive you what you've done." And my question is, should conservatives be all that uptight? Should liberals be all that excited? In other words, can one person overcome the infrastructure and the hierarchy that is Rome to move in any direction?
I think that he knows that very well, and that's why, as a good Jesuit, he's sending mixed messages. Just this morning, he sent a message thanking a Vatican Monsignor for his work, for his historiographical work on the Second Vatican Council, and that is the worst possible work of history on Vatican II that has been done. But this guy is a hero of the conservatives. So Pope Francis knows that he has to talk to different audiences. What's different? So I would say that, in my opinion, the polarization in the church between conservative and liberals is largely overstated. It exists, but it's very localized in some centers, in some places. I think that this fact of bringing up that there are different aisles, different cultures, it serves the extremes. It doesn't serve the real people in the pew. So he knows that, I think. Again, my impression is that there are many people who are so upset with him because many thought that after 2005, with the election of Pope Benedict, the Catholic Church had taken a very clear direction that was not going to change. So there's this tale of one of the most important neoconservative intellectuals in Rome, April 19th, 2005, he shouted at people saying, "We won, you lost, it's over." And I think that they really believe that. The Catholic Church is a very surprising animal. It changes a lot, it moves, it's alive. So, yeah, he's very aware of that. He's very aware of that. So I'm hopeful about that.
Yeah, I would say, if there's, of course, if you're these days on the blogosphere, right, the Catholic blogosphere, right, the one thing that Catholic conservatives are most interested in are Catholic liberals. The one thing Catholic liberals are most interested in are Catholic conservatives. And none of them seem to be interested in God very much, or Jesus. I mean, I say that sort of half jokingly, of course, but you mentioned his quip after his election, but the story is the 3-minute talk he gave at one of the general congregations prior to the actual conclave assembling stressed a different kind of distinction, right, than I think many Catholics, especially in the United States, are used to hearing about. His reference to a church closed in on itself, right, a self-referential church, versus the church that, as Massimo was saying, is going out, especially all the way to the periphery, right? I mean, I think we think about that as the distinction, not liberal and conservative, that really animates Francis's mind. I mean, we may get closer to what he's all about. And there's another, in that Vallely book, there's another remark that Bergoglio seems to be a kind of character, unique perhaps, who spans a distinction or spans a divide, another kind of divide. Again, the divide on the one hand between the self-referential church, the church that's focused in on itself and cultivates sort of individual spirituality, right? And on the other hand, right, the church that's in the world, the activist church, right, the church that's out there, but doesn't give much attention or care much about the devotional practices of the people, right? And for him, this isn't a workable distinction. He doesn't buy that, right? So he seems to me to be challenging, as I was saying to Bryce, right, all the kind of conventional distinctions that American Catholics especially love. And maybe it's a nice time to begin to question a lot of them.